I'm going to introduce some concepts to you, some theories related to racial identity development, critical self-reflection, and these things as a foundation for culturally responsive teaching and leadership. And this is going to require that we define these terms, cultural responsiveness and racial identity. And it's also going to require that all of us engage in this process of critical reflection. All right, so to begin, what does it mean to be culturally responsive? I want to hear from you all. So in your words, when you hear that term culturally responsive, what does that mean? Just please type any thoughts you have in the chat. Anyone? Here we go. To exercise situational awareness about the individual's engagement. I like that one. That's good. Some reflection. To be attentive to the needs and concerns of an inclusive group of people. I think that's a really rich, that's a good description. Recognizing that the experience of others is not the same as our own and being sensitive to that. These are all good. And we're getting really close to the way that Geneva Gay and Gloria Latson Billings talk about cultural responsiveness. So for them, what it means is that we understand that our traditional ways of teaching and serving students sometimes, often, undermine the success of historically marginalized students. So what this means is that all of us, we need to be trained to enhance the success of students by using their cultural frames of reference. And we also need to be trained to engage in critiques of social justice and liberatory action. And there are at least these three sort of tenets associated with that. They tell us that teaching must yield academic success, that it must help students develop positive ethnic and cultural identities while enhancing their academic achievement, and also that we have to promote students' capacities to recognize, understand, and critique current social inequalities. And all these principles, this definition, this applies to everyone working with students, not just folks who are in classrooms, but all of us who serve and lead in any way. So my next question for you all, what are some obstacles to becoming culturally responsive or practicing cultural responsiveness? What do you all think? Maybe what have you experienced? Not knowing about other cultures. Yeah, that would be significant. Yeah, fragility, colorblindness, bias. Yes. Someone actually really nailed I think one of the most detrimental aspects of this, and it's color blindness. And whoops, I'm going to show you what I mean by that. So when we talk about color blindness, here's a quick clip.
Man, there were so many incredible, super diverse movies last year.
Diverse movies?
Yeah, like Moonlight or Lion, Hidden Figures and Fences, movies that didn't like just feature white people.
So interesting. I never really thought about that.
Really? Even after the whole Oscars so white thing and all the articles written about it?
Call me crazy, but I just don't see race. I guess I'm just the least racist person here.
Okay. Race is like often like a pretty obvious thing to observe. It's not like racist to notice.
I had to laugh. Zach, oh my goodness. I only see one race.
Ugh.
The human race.
Such bullshit. You're only telling yourself that so you don't have to think about racism or confront your own prejudices.
No, I'm not prejudiced, okay? I don't even judge Scrap for being a woman.
All right. So that's a video clip that I sometimes share with my students just to get them thinking about maybe what color blindness means in real life. And it's silly, but I think it gets to the point. But specifically, according to research, according to Benia Silva, this kind of thinking, this kind of ideology, color blindness occurs when people embrace a few things, like the ideas like the minimization of racism. And that is largely, what it says there, which is when people come to believe that discrimination is no longer a crucial factor in any minority's life chances. So while we're here's focusing specifically on race, it could be related to gender or anything, any other form of oppression. Also the cultural racism frame. So relying on culturally based arguments, such as, well, the reason why Black students or Mexican students, it's cultural. They don't put that much emphasis on education in those cultures. This kind of thinking can be categorized or understood as this the social equality maxim, which is ultimately a broad belief that gender, race, and any of these things, they don't have an impact on any of our students' ability to flourish in our classrooms or on our campuses. This really gets at the crux of what color blindness is. So, how do we manage this? Like, how is it that we can move beyond color blindness? Well, it's important things to keep in mind. First of all, is that it's really difficult work. It's not easy. It's ongoing work. The process is not one that's going to come to an end. You can't expect to get it 100% right. It's not going to be perfect. And also the way that you become culturally responsive, it's going to differ a bit based on who you are. So for example, for a white person, becoming culturally responsive might mean recognizing, taking responsibility for some power and privileges that you might have, acknowledging feelings that you might have about multiculturalism, and then it certainly will require cultivating a desire for your own personal understanding and growth related to those issues. For a person of color, it might mean recognizing that there are some significant differences across class and socioeconomic status among people of color, and understanding like the way that different people of color attend to various forms of oppression could be different, that there's not always going to be solidarity, and that there might be different challenges, different ways of addressing and challenging oppression. Whoops. Sorry, there we go. Sorry about that. So this is where we get a chance to talk about racial identity development. But I guess maybe now, are there any questions? If you have questions or any comments, you can put those in the chat.
Yeah, before you jump into that, I was actually going to say I was literally just typing. My apologies, I forgot to add that if anyone had any questions, we were going to have a Q&A for all of this. But if folks do have questions along the way that this is set up, I won't do it next time, but it's set up like an event. But if you do want to ask a question, feel free to raise your hand, and then I'll request that you unmic yourself, and then you can pose it to Aaron.
All right. So here's one of the core reasons that we all, based on our race, have different journeys. It has to do with our racial identity development. So racial identity development theory, it comes from William Cross back in the 70s and Janet Helms and several others as recent, really as 2004, 2005. And ultimately, what this theory holds is that all of us, like individuals, we develop our sense of collective identity based on perceptions that we share with our common racial heritage with a particular group, and that those our collective identity influences our beliefs, our attitudes, and our values relative to racial groups other than our own. So, and what the theory tells us is that all of us have a journey from I'll say, uh, an unsophisticated understanding of who we are racially to an increasingly sophisticated understanding of who we are racially. And while if you're looking at these two diagrams I have here, you see there are arrows that go back and forth. This journey is not necessarily linear. It can be recursive, and you can reach the end of the continuum and fall back. So this is all it so much depends upon our environment and who we are in our environment, um, and how much we attend to our own growth. So one of the other things that you'll notice is that both for people of color and for white folks, that in the preliminary stages, contact or conformity, that they're essentially it's the same sort of uh, concept, right? So in the beginning, our racial identity is, um, I'll say, informed by the fact that we're oblivious to racism or how we might participate in it. And then for both groups, the the goal is that we would evolve to the final stage, whether it's autonomy or integrative awareness, where we have developed not only a pride in our own race, but also this willingness and this capacity to respect um, and admire others and to be of service. So to challenge racism and other forms of oppression. According to this theory, it's important to point out that the primary challenge, concern in white racial identity development is recognizing and then abandoning racism. And this is not necessarily individual or personal racism, although that's part of it, but more so, I'd say, recognizing systemic and institutional racism and how that might affect the way uh, we, we perceive the world. And it's similar for people of color. The central concern there is abandoning any in sort of internalized oppression that might influence how we perceive ourselves and other races. All right. So having said all of that, this is related.
Before you
Oh,
go
go ahead.
on, before you go, because I have a question, because I also want to like make sure that we clarify as well. So going back to this is the way that I interpret it. So with
Mhm.
abandoning for white folks being able to abandon racism is not necessarily saying that white people are racist, but more or less abandoning these systems that are in place that perpetuate racism, right? So,
Yes, yes,
so I mean, it
yes.
actually
So
could be both and like if acknowledging that folks, growing up in racist societies, that then makes us racist by the mere fact that we participate in it, or the fact that we've internalized that oppression, right? But then also too acknowledging and being able to dismantle the system by abandoning the system as well. I guess more of a statement, I guess more than a question.
no, I agree with the way that you've conceptualized that. I mean, because ultimately, so if we're thinking about those original stages, statuses, actually, we call them, where people are oblivious to the impact of race and racism. So in order to develop a sophisticated racial identity, you first have to come to a place where and again, this is it doesn't matter really what your race is, but you have to come to a place where you're able to say, yeah, I there is systemic bias, there is systemic oppression, there is institutional racism, and whether I recognize it or not, implicitly or explicitly, I'm probably participating in some ways. So you have to get there before you can do, and we're going to talk about this in a second, that sort of the critical sort of reflection that it enables you to become increasingly sophisticated in your thoughts about this. And really, so this slide here shows the link between reaching those final stages and cultural responsiveness. So in order for all of us to be culturally responsive, among the competencies that are associated with that are, we have to be able to reflect on our own cultural lenses and use that information to be helpful to others, right? And we have to be able to recognize and address, and this is what you were just talking about, Cortez, bias in the system if we're going to deal with it. In order to be able to do those things, you have to reach those final stages where you have an informed, positive racial group commitment, a capacity to relinquish the privileges of racism, and then the will to actually deal with racism and other forms of oppression. So and that's how those two things are linked for us. All right. So in order to get to a place uh, where we have those more sophisticated racial identities and we can be more culturally responsive for our students, we have to critically self-reflect. And what I mean by that is, coming from the research and the literature, is that we have to be at a place where we can grapple honestly with the reality of race, racism, and racial politics in the U.S. and in our environments and our own role in perpetuating those things. And what this means is that we have to do what some folks call a conscious exploration. Richard Milner, um, he calls it a deep, deliberate search. Whatever you call it, it means that you're going to be really engaged in looking inward and observing and asking yourself questions about your experiences and the way that you understand things, looking for patterns in your own behavior and your thoughts and your attitudes, and then using that information to make changes. First, in the way that you perceive yourself and your students and other people that you deal with, and then expanding that to a broader sense where we can deal with more systemic issues. All right. Any questions or anything? All right. So here's the process that Milner suggests that we use to really engage in critical self-reflection. There are three really key features of this. First, we have to reflect on ourselves. And it's just like as I was saying before on the previous slide, you have to ask yourself these racially and culturally grounded questions, like what is it that I think and believe? You have to really probe those sorts of questions. You have to reflect on yourself in relationship to others. So when we're talking about higher ed folks, people who are educators and staff members and leaders and so forth, you have to think about who are my students and how might they see the world, and how does the way I see the world come together with the way they see the world. And then finally, he suggests that we have to then start thinking about how we shift from ourselves to the system, how we can make changes in the system. And that means we have to think about, okay, we have to understand ourselves and our particular points of view, but also we have to think about the context that we're in, the history, the politics, the various arrangements of our institutions, and how they shape the way that we behave, think, teach, lead, and how they shape the way our students react to those things. So we were hoping to be able to engage in some small group work around these things, but I think we have a relatively small group, so we might be able to do this together. So I don't know. So as moderator, Cortez, you want to try to lead this part of the discussion?
Yeah, so as what Aaron just stated. So I didn't know the way we set it up. We set this up as an event style, but with that, we can't break out into we can't break up into breakout groups. So for next time, we will be able to do that. But for this particular conversation, so yeah, we're just gonna enter into some small group discussions. If you would like to participate, as many people that can participate as possible would be great. If you are more of you just want to listen at this stage, that is perfectly fine too. We just ask that everyone continue to stay engaged. But we'll just run through all of these questions kind of just one by one. So we'll go through reflecting on the self, the reflecting on the self in relation to students, and then shifting from the self to the system. So the first piece of that, and then this will take probably about the next 10 minutes, 10, 12 minutes, but we'll just start with that piece as first. So would anyone like to, and of course, please feel free to request to unmute yourself, but answer that question, what is my racial and cultural heritage, and then how do I know? All right, so Deborah.
What our racial and cultural heritage is. I know that there are some tests that you can take where you can, send off and get your DNA analyzed. But what other ways when you don't have the history? All of my grandparents have been deceased for quite some time. So the knowledge that I have is just surface knowledge. And from what I've gotten from my parents, which on my father's side was not as much information as, of course, it was from my mother's side. So, what are some steps that we can take in order to find out what our cultural and racial heritage actually is?
That's a good question. I like, so I feel like you're talking about, initially you're talking about like 23andMe, those sorts of, those kinds of tests and things. So I think, so part of this, when we're talking about race in particular, is defining what we mean by race. And so it, one of the things that, when my students, when we talk about this and define it, is that we're careful to talk about race as a social construction, and that's separate from the biological and genetic piece, meaning that, like, so race is not, it's not determined by anything biological. It's really determined by how society perceives people and constructs meaning about, uh, most often, phenotypical expressions. So I think that one of the ways that people come to understand their racial and cultural heritage is what you were talking about. So you talk to your family, you reflect on your own personal experiences. So how do I know I'm African American? Well, some people are calling me African American. So what does that mean to me? Like, somebody is putting that on me. So now I have to make sense of what that means. Um, but because it's a social construct, I don't know that there is a hard and fast way for any of us to frame our race in that way. I don't know if that, does that help?
Yeah, because I want to add on to that, and this actually ties into what Dr. Carter just put in the chat. So learning about one's heritage or her particular heritage from conversations and finding lost family. Um, One thing that I know just through my studies, particularly with African American, African history and everything, is being able to understand the significance and the importance of storytelling, kind of what you said earlier. So, a huge part of folks coming over to America, either forcefully or um, I guess, voluntarily, is about being able to continue on, storytelling and talking about the history of one's, not only like their culture, but where they're from, and then the various different practices and rituals and different things like that, which often get lost along the way as generations continue to pass. So, and I think that kind of speaks to, I just had a student in my office the other day who wants to have a program talking about, the disconnect between African students and then African American students. And think part of that is, part of those conversations as well. Sarah, you asked a question. Are we being unmuted? If you would like to be unmuted, put your hand up and then I'll go ahead and I'll unmute you. But we also had some other folks who put some other comments in the side. Um, Gail stating, I am white, but I didn't really understand that I had a race until my 20s. Being white was ubiquitous in mostly segregated communities, for sure.
Yeah. Yeah. So thank you for saying that. And I think these are great questions. So the next part of this, reflecting on self, is so as we think about that, what our racial and cultural heritage is, then you have to think about what that means. So how does that affect the way that I engage with others? So I don't know if anyone's willing to speak to that.
Well, I just unmuted or requested to unmute Sarah for the response, but also let me echo what Dr. Carter just stated. Race is a social construct with very real experiences. That's powerful.
Yes. Yes. Yeah, that's exactly. Just because it's a social construct and not real per se doesn't mean that it doesn't have a real impact on how people experience the world.
Oh, hi. So I like that these are great questions. So this is Sarah. Hello. And if you can't tell from my accent, I am from Georgia. I am twangy as they come. Uh, so I had for my own, I grew up in such a fascinating place. Um, you know, my dad, I asked my dad once what's something you really like, really profoundly remember from your childhood or whatever. And the very first thing he said was when they integrated the schools. That was a big deal. And that had a huge impact on him. And I was like, was it violent? Was it scary? Because no, not in our case, it wasn't. It was just unusual. It was like, oh, okay, this is happening. And it was a profound moment for him. So I then wonder, with my own self, I remember when people of same sex could get married, and that'll be my story that I have, and I wonder what story my own children uh, will tell. But as the racial and cultural heritage, it's like I did do the ancestry in me. I spit in the cup. It was gross. I sent it off, and it came back. What I found was interesting because I always thought I'd always been told, "Oh, we're Irish." No, we are not. So it's interesting when we say, we pass these stories down from people. I wonder sometimes if we accidentally pass the wrong story or just the incorrect story. Um, I am very, very, very British and very Scottish, and based on that information. But it does come into play in that the foods that we eat, that we're always the loudest person in the room, so we can certainly trace those small elements back down the line. Uh, but yeah, that was just my interesting experience, and how it's again, I find it really interesting. My dad, it was the very first thing he said right out of his mouth was that moment. That was a big deal. And it just led me down the road of thinking, what will my own kids have one day to talk about? Thank
Yeah,
you.
thank you for sharing that.
And we have Dr. Carter.
Yeah, I was just going to, I guess, share something similar to Sarah, like when she was mentioning that she learned, that there was this information that was, I guess, incorrect based on what families had shared or her family had shared previously. So a similar thing happened to me as well. And I actually, using Ancestry, found or got in touch with family members that I never knew. And it wasn't using the actual DNA testing or anything like that. It was just searching for information on my mom because I don't have that information. So that was recent. So I went literally 39 years not knowing about, well, actually thinking that my mom was Italian, and that was completely incorrect. I put her heritage in the chat already, but yeah, so those are stories my dad told me. I don't know where he got Italian from, but that's not what it was. So, but yeah, so like you could go your entire life, thinking something about yourself and making up these stories, and then all of a sudden everything changes. So,
Yeah, you all are reminding me. I'm going to show you this book called How the Word is Passed by Clint Smith. And he basically, this book is about um, some of what you all are describing. So, how is it that we come to, like as a country, we come to understand uh, what our racial heritage is as a country? And through his research, what he uncovers is, well, the stories that we've told ourselves about what race means in this country have changed and molded and split, and so that the initial our real social our initial social construct of these things is not at all the way that we understand things today. In any case, it's a good read. um, yeah, Dr. Carter read it. That's good to see.
Yeah, and so we're gonna move on to like the next section of that. If anyone would like to jump in with it, just raise your hand in the side. But I do want to acknowledge something that Dr. Gordon also put in the side. First off, if I've acknowledged you by your first name, it's because I don't know that you've earned your doctorate. So if you have, I apologize, but I know that Seth has, so that's why I'm calling him, referring to him as Dr. Gordon, as well as Dr. Carter, which I can clearly see that. But one of the things he states is that culture is not geography. We can be bound to a place by DNA, but culturally something else. We can become culturally proficient in other ways of being as well. And all of that is true. One thing I'll also add with that is that we can also culturally appropriate other people as well, which that can then cross, lines of like racism and different things. I don't think that's where he's necessarily going with, but that's like another added component of the conversation as well. Is when certain cultures become appropriated. It's one of the things we use as a common example of it, which is like within the Black community. There's a lot of things that are started or have been started within the Black community where it's frowned upon, but then it becomes cool in certain other elements. So I think that's another thing to kind of look for as well. But your second section of questions, reflecting on the self in relation to others, we have about probably 5 more minutes, but with this particular section, this slide. So, what is the cultural and racial heritage and historical landscape of our students here at Wright State University? One thing that I will say as a hint is, what do we define ourselves or as a university, which is typically a predominantly white institution, but then being able to balance that with the demographics or the racial demographics of the students that we serve as well. So then that ties into the second question, which is, in what ways do our students' racial and cultural backgrounds influence how they experience the world? And I think that causes us to think about the ways in which our predominantly white students experience Wright State University, and a conversation that we had just in the Belinga Center with particularly our Black students, which is the Black student experience at Wright State University, and we can put that into all student conversations as well. But would anyone like to add a comment about that? Go ahead and raise your hand if you would like to. And sorry, Amber, I'm going to go ahead and unmute Sarah again. There we go. Or request.
Again, something else about being Southern. We love to talk. Uh, it's really interesting that you bring that up because Dr. Corey C. Miller over in the College of Health Education and Human Services last year gave this really wonderful lecture on her research of Generation Z. And so these are young people. I think it's born between 95 and 2010. So it was really interesting to like how is this, and I'm a Gen Xer, so how is an X different from a Y, different from a Z? What are the things that they are experiencing in their moments? So it was really fascinating to listen to how they communicate, and how they perceive information, how they interpret information. But this discussion brings up a good point in the sense of I wonder if the Generation Z experience, how it would be different, or how it is going to be different, or currently different for students who are minorities as opposed to students who are not, from that particular perspective. And I didn't know if you gentlemen had any perspective or know if of any research on that particular aspect.
I don't have, not me, Cortez, do you? Nothing specifically.
No, nothing
I think
specific.
that's a really interesting question.
Yeah. No, and
I would say
go ahead.
I would say for me, so I'm sorry, this question for me, when I teach pre-service teachers, we call it their diversity class. It's diversity in in contemporary society. And it's a class that's supposed to help prepare them to be culturally responsive educators. So I'm African American. That's how I self-identify, right? And I'm dealing with pre-service teachers, and I'm betting that some of you are aware of the statistics, but over 80% of pre-service teachers are white and female. And actually in Ohio, it's over 90%. So for me, um, there's immediately a racial difference and potentially a cultural difference. And so these are questions that I think about, and I engage my students in this conversation because for many of them I'm the first African American teacher at any level that they've ever had, and I ask them, I'm like, look, I recognize this could be a very different situation for a lot of you. What do you think about this? So that's how I get to know or understand the differences in my racial and cultural heritage versus my students, and then we talk about how that affects maybe the way um, I see the world and they see the world. Now, I think the vast majority of them are probably Generation Z folks who are a little bit younger than that. But go ahead, Cortez. You were going to say something.
Oh, no, no, no. I was just gonna moving forward to like the next question, but of course I want to acknowledge what Amber and Nick said in the comment.
Yeah.
But curious to raised to believing I'm, I'm curious if we're raised believing we're one identity, and then especially later in life discover that we are not. That experience and believing one thing still shapes us. I suppose it's a philosophical question, but if we recognize things are social constructs with real experiences, how do those experiences that turn out to be wrong then shape our identities? That is a very great philosophical question. I'm immediately drawn to a perspective that Dr. Carter would be able to add on that because she's so huge with intersectionality, and I'm going to request that she unmute herself to see if she would like to answer that.
I don't know what you want me to say, Cortez, but I mean, for me, and this is just my personal experience, though, yes, of course, those things still impact how I show up, how they, how I interact with people. It has shaped like my knowledge of things because, like, for again 30, well, not all 39 years, but for a really long time, I spent time trying to discover that part of myself that actually wasn't a part of myself. So, so those things are still part of who I am. Um, and I guess it goes back to, I don't know, like it's just also, it is a philosophical question because I'm still exploring, you know, who I am as well now because I found this other information out. But I'm always exploring these things. So, because that's like that actualizing that we do as humans is like always trying to become. So that again is philosophical, I guess. But
Yeah,
I
and
don't know if that helps, Quatez. I don't know exactly what you wanted me to say,
no,
but
that was basically it. And let me also apologize to Nick. So there's a reason why they weren't able, or we haven't changed your name because at the University of Toledo they have my name backwards as Scott Quatez or whatever. I don't know if they thought that there's no way that my name could be Quatez Scott. So the whole name change is like difficult there too. So I personally don't know you, Nick. So I didn't, and I appreciate the vulnerability in sharing that in the chat box. So I was literally just saying that as a joke, but I clearly did know you. So I apologize for making that making that particular joke. I was also going to add on to that we've had conversations in our program, philosophically speaking, that when it comes to identities, one of the things that we overly promote in America is just the idea that we're just all Americans. And when we put us in the category from a nationalistic perspective, the humanity of each person is ultimately rejected and denied because we don't focus on the true diversity among all of us. So when we have now these minority, because what we think about when it ultimately comes the idea of being an American, also typically isn't ideas or images of folks within the LGBTQ community or folks who are people of color or immigrants or whatever. We celebrate those things and we put them in documents, but when we talk about the actual imagery, those things or those individuals, those people do not necessarily come to mind. So I think that's part of like that philosophical question as well, is that we just overly promote and we basically ingrain this idea of just being American versus being able to discuss, the differences, the human differences between all of these Americans as well. So that gets us to shifting from ourselves to the system as well. And we'll just pose this as a rhetorical question for folks to kind of think about before we move on. But what is the contextual nature of race, racism, and culture at Wright State and the broader community? How do we know that? But a really great question, I love this question, is what systemic and organizational barriers and structures shape people's experiences at Wright State University and in the broader community? How do we know that? So how are we aware of the barriers that exist? And what is our frame of reference when it comes to those things as well? So thank you all for who participated in the discussion.
All right. So there are a lot of great questions in the chat, and hopefully we'll have some time to go back to some of those that we missed. So are we going to attempt to allow people to speak to that question, Cortez, the final one, or are we going to move forward?
Oh, I mean, we have like 20 minutes left. This goes until 1:15. So if you feel like you have enough time and you want to hear some answers from folks, this is also your show too.
Well, I wonder, I suspect that this might be one that this would be a good one, I think, for people to talk about if they're open to talking about it. But if not,
Yeah.
we can certainly.
Well, I'll read off two comments. One from Gail. So there is so much color blindness at the university that it's frustrating. Definitely see that as well. And then Dr. Gordon, we know if we actually ask the question and believe the answers that people give and not rationalize the answers away. One of the things, speaking directly to that, is when I first got here, one of the things that I asked for was our institutional data on student experiences here at the university. And the only data that I was given were the responses from students when they visited the university. So I don't necessarily know if there's like still some data that's out there that but that was the only data that I was given. So that speaks to people that are interested in attending the university, but that doesn't speak to people's lived experiences as members of the community. And then she knows I can't pronounce her last name, so I apologize. But a big concern for her is the assumption of what students know, how much of our structure is built on the assumption of knowledge students bring. Yes, very much so. And we're working together on some other things as well.
Okay. Well, I think that's a good start, I think. I'm sure you all are going to continue to have those conversations, right, going forward. So this is going to be our debrief, but we did that. So I want to take the last bit of our discussion to look at how we can use some of the information, this self-reflection, critical self-reflection that we just engaged in, along with a few more tools to actually instigate some change. So I'm going to show you this video, and then after the video, we'll have a brief discussion, and then I'm going to show you some tools. All right, let's see if we can make this work here.
A local high school cross-country runner gets disqualified after the race because she was wearing a hijab. Tonight, we're getting answers if someone was in the wrong with the DQ or not. Amy Steigerwald spoke with her local athlete. Amy, what can you tell us?
Well, Christy, Noor Abu Karam has been running for Northview for 3 years now and always wears her hijab while competing. So naturally, it was shocking for her and her entire family when she crossed the finish line on Saturday and was told she was disqualified. Noor Abu Karam is a junior in high school and proudly wears her Nike Sport hijab when running for Sylvania Northview. And it's never been a problem for the last 3 years until her most recent meet. Officials began their usual uniform check before the race. When Noor saw officials talking to each other, she assumed it was about her hijab.
And in the back of my mind was, are they going to say something about my hijab or about my uniform, because it is different?
But instead, Noor's teammate was approached by officials, telling her that her shorts were out of uniform and that she must change to run. But they did not say anything to Noor about her hijab. However, after crossing the finish line, Noor did not see her name on the board.
And then they were like, well, you got disqualified. And I was like, for what, And they're like, because of your hijab.
Despite not being told prior to the race, Noor's hijab was out of uniform, allowing her to be disqualified.
And like my heart dropped. I felt like something horrible happened to me, something that I always thought could happen, but never has happened, I think I was mostly embarrassed because I never expected it to happen.
The Ohio High School Athletic Association requires coaches to have a waiver for athletes wearing anything that is not a part of league-approved uniforms. Noor's family and coach were unaware she needed a waiver, mainly because she's been competing in multiple sports for the past 3 years, wearing her hijab with no issues. Now for the next meet, Noor has to have a special letter saying she can wear her hijab, and while she's happy she will be permitted to run, she's also disappointed she must have a letter in the first place.
It's a part of me, and I'm not going to take it off so I can run. I just don't want this to happen to anybody else. Like any other girls younger than me that are wearing hijab that are going to start running. I don't want them to ever have to worry or to have to write a letter so they can go run.
Now, Noor wanted to make it clear her coach and her teammates have all been incredibly supportive of her wearing her hijab and are also confused about this rule. We reached out to the Ohio Athletic Association. They explained for us that their official was simply enforcing the rules, but did not make it clear as to why they did not tell her before the race that it was an issue. Reporting live in studio, Amy Steigerwald, WTOL.
Okay, sorry for those of you who maybe could not see because of the captioning. So I wanted to use that case, this instance, to get us thinking about how to apply the critical self-reflection that we were just engaging in with another framework that enables us to work through some potential solutions. So if you can imagine, I understand that this is high school, but imagine that this occurred, this event happened to a Wright State student. And how would we how would we address that? Would we make changes in policies and so forth? How will we even begin to consider that? So this framework is called the Equity Literacy Framework, gives us some tools to do that. It has seven steps. And what I'm going to ask you to do is talk with me, talk with us as we work through each of the steps in relationship to that event. So the first thing that we need to do, and some of us, like we already engaged in this, is to identify biases and inequities. And we start with our own, recognizing our own racial and cultural backgrounds and how they might influence the way that we determine whether or not we see any biases or inequities. And this also requires that we are able to think about, so if for faculty members, you're probably aware of the term the hidden curriculum. Basically, this is an opportunity for us to be aware of things that maybe you can't see that also have an impact. So implicit biases or inequities. So anybody, do you feel like there were any biases or inequities in this situation?
Yeah, as a reminder, folks can like raise their hand and then I'll unmute them. Another thing to also keep in mind as like when I talk about biases, one of my favorite definitions that I deliver is that a bias isn't always necessarily about a discriminatory thing versus being our bias toward a preference toward like one thing or another or like what comes natural to us. So the bias, one clearly that we can identify within that is that in our culture here in America, or as Christians, right? Like we don't necessarily wear hijabs, so like we're biased in that way. So like, how can we create a process where, for like even with what was stated in there, like the student having to moving forward to continue submitting like these waivers or whatever, is like every single time that they compete, they're still going to have to submit a waiver, which folks who don't wear a hijab won't have to do that.
Right, right.
Yes, Dr.
Yeah. So, so the next part would be to try to put yourselves in the shoes of everybody involved. So the different stakeholders. So from the perspective of the athletes, from the perspective of the refs and so forth, like what ways might their way of seeing their cultural backgrounds influence how they're experiencing this event? Um, any thoughts about that?
Doesn't look like folks want to speak, but if they put comments in, how about that? I'll just read them off.
Okay. Okay. I mean, I can imagine from the perspective of maybe the ref, and they sort of alluded this to the story, that his or her opinion was like, well, I'm enforcing the rules. I'm doing what I was told to do.
Yeah, and Dr. English, the reason that was given was that I guess in the particular sport, headgear isn't approved, so the student's hijab was headgear that wasn't approved. So
Yeah, and part of the issue is that the uniform, so everybody has to have identical uniforms. So if some students are wearing headgear and others are not, that's an infraction of the rules.
yeah, Dr.
Yeah.
Sahin, Eric's about to speak. Go ahead, go Eric.
Oh, thank you. I'm a little late. I was trying to get on the last question, but I'm having technical issues. What you said, Cortez, um, about people thinking about what they're used to and being maybe leaving people out because they're thinking mostly about what they're used to. I think was exactly the point I was thinking about as I was trying to work through, starting with my identity, about being white, but pretty much as white as you can be, both biologically and where I grew up. It hit me that a white person probably made those rules, right? And wasn't even a thought. We had an incident several years ago in intramurals with a student from India who was a Sikh and wore the Sikh headdress. And we had a rule in intramurals that you couldn't wear hats when you played, and had not even considered it as an issue until it happened. And the intramural supervisor wouldn't let a student play because they wouldn't remove their headdress because hats weren't allowed, and couldn't think beyond what the rule was. And I think I struggle quite often in trying to understand biases that are unintended in rules, at least unintended from my part in rules, and trying to work a lot harder in recent years to try to identify those, and make sure that any rules we have in place have a rationale that is grounded in inclusiveness and diversity. And got a long way to go, a really long way to go there. But I think what you just showed was a great example of that challenge.
Thank you, Eric, and I really appreciate that example as well. And Dr. Sahin, to answer your question, what was the reason that they didn't challenge it in the beginning? I don't think they ever gave a rationale for why they didn't address it, but I do think of Cat Williams, who's a comedian, and he gave, in one of his stand-ups, he gave this example, poor little Tink Tink. But there was this sprinter, this racer, who ended up having like both of their legs amputated, and they then went to a race, in a full race with people that did not have that had full abilities. No one said anything at the beginning of the race that the person who was intending to race couldn't race, but that person ended up winning the race, and then he was disqualified at the end of it, and then they stated that he had quote unquote an unfair advantage because of those legs. So that's one of the things where it's they waited all the way until the end, and it's the same thing with this student until she got to the end where she won the race, and then now all of a sudden it's, oh, you broke a rule, or now it was unfair for one reason or the other. So it's just one of those issues that we continue running into. All right, number 3.
Yeah, I think that I'm going to say Eric because I can't see the name. What he was just speaking about really gets to this, considering possible challenges and opportunities. So this point about thinking about, okay, so what are the actual barriers to addressing the inequity? What is preventing us from doing it? Are there structural barriers that inhibit us from doing this? And so that is, and I think as you rightfully pointed out, it can be a real challenge to figure these sorts of things out. But if we're going to make the kind of changes that we're hoping to make, to go back, reflect back to the beginning of the presentation where we looked at your diversity statement, if we want to realize that these are the things that you have to do this, you have to wrestle with this. Just in the interest of time, I'm going to go on to the next one. So, and I think you maybe got to this one as well. The next step is to think about, okay, so what would an equitable outcome be? How would you create that? What are you all, do you have any thoughts about what an equitable outcome would be in this situation that we're describing? Or even the situation that, I'll say Eric one more time, was describing, because it's very similar, it is, except it's very specific to your college environment. What would it look like?
Dr. Carter says create a religious or ethical provision. That's great. Another thing too to think of, when we talk about equitable, another concept to think of is fair. What would be fair in this situation?
Fair, just,
yeah.
And yeah, and understanding that the difference between equal and equitable.
Dr. English, it seems like you can go two ways. One is to create a provision, the other is to allow everyone to wear hats or headgear to have modifications to the uniform.
Sure.
The simple things, right?
So the next thing then that you should do, working in these groups to do this, is when you have that outcome in mind, now you actually need to figure out, okay, how is it that we're going to achieve this? What are the things that can be done right now to achieve this outcome? And then ultimately, then work on the longer term goals, which in this instance and other similar instances would probably be policy adjustments or practice adjustments. You're going to have to look at the the Ohio State Athletic Association will have to look at their rules and procedures and make changes in the same way that a university might have to look at their rules and their procedures and make those changes. We are really running low, like, on time. So does anybody have any thoughts about this?
No,
Okay. And then of course you would create the action plan, but we're going to move forward from that. So ultimately, as closing out this discussion is, so what I'm hoping that people will draw from this is an understanding that our racial identity, or in some ways our individual prejudices, have an impact or are informed by the cultural biases that we grow up with, like the systemic oppression and so forth that we may not even be aware of. They shape the way that we understand the world. But especially folks who are in positions of authority at institutions, our individual prejudices and biases, our racial identity development level can have a direct impact on the policies and practices at our institutions. And so if we're not careful and thoughtful, if we don't work hard at and continually at our critical self-analysis and working toward a more sophisticated racial identity, we're going to continue to contribute to this cycle, right? So really, I don't know if this, I don't want to overstate this, but I feel like it is our responsibility as educators, as leaders, as staff members, to attend to our racial identity. So I'm going to stop there and open up. I don't know how much time we have. Any time left for questions at all?
me and a couple of my peers in this session, we have a meeting at one, well, literally at 1 o'clock that we're 15 minutes late for, but we'll go to it because it's right outside. But yeah, if anyone has any questions, we'll be here for another 3 or 4 minutes to answer any questions that anyone may have. Yes. So there's Aaron's contact information. So if you would like copies of the slide PDF form, you feel free to reach out to Aaron.
Yeah, whatever. Yeah, please reach out to me. And I know that some of you had some questions earlier that we didn't get to respond to. If you still have those questions, shoot me an email. I'll be happy to talk with any of you about anything.
Oh, so these are just all the thank yous. So yeah, Dr. English, yeah. So there's his information. Actually, I can send it to you. I can send it to folks as well, right? Unless
Sure.
if you unless you really want to get in contact with Aaron specifically, please feel free to reach out to him. Um, he's great with being able to have conversations and connect with other students as well. But I also have copies of these slides as well. There is a link that I've embedded inside of, or that I put in the chat. So if you could all give us your feedback on this presentation, how it all went for you. If you've got nothing nice to say, just don't say anything at all, is what Aaron said. He wanted me to communicate that. But yeah, we will be having these conversations once a month. So if you have anything that you would also like to have addressed, please feel free to reach out to us. And if you have other colleagues in your areas that want to access this particular session, we did have it recorded, so it's going to be hosted on the Belinga webpage as well. Also, let me say it's pretty cool that there happened to be an apple sitting behind me this entire time, so it looks like very students.
Thank you all for your time.